Arena's sense of public relations did not fail him. He starts to pander. He says Senator Kennedy had been, quote, as cooperative as he could possibly be. Damore points out this declaration hardly matched the senator's refusal to answer a single question about the accident. Arena could not conceive of anything Kennedy gained by delaying the report of the accident. He said, quote, I don't know what went through his mind. He very well could have been in a state of shock, end quote. Welcome back to my channel. This is episode 4 of our walk through Leo Damore's book, Chappaquiddick. We have walked through the early finding of the accident. We have seen the evidence that was found by the initial investigators and search and rescue crew. We have walked through Police Chief Jim Arena's office and the goings-on there, including Senator Ted Kennedy's eventual statement that he wrote out and the reaction to it. Today, we're going to be getting deeper into the Ted Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. At the end of the last episode, Ted Kennedy was sealed away, his family's compound there in Hyannisport. And so we are going to learn more about what was all happening there. I'm Jess Cannell, and I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into our reading. We are starting with chapter 8. In Falmouth, Jimmy Smith had waited anxiously for further reports from Dick Ferry about the accident at Chappaquiddick. A second call confirmed a fatality was involved. The identities of neither the victim nor the driver of the car were known. Around 3 o'clock, Ferry called to say that Ted Kennedy had been identified as the driver of the accident car. Jimmy Smith was the assistant DA and a former Kennedy political campaign advance man. So he's getting the news and trying to keep up. He was stunned. He had spent most of his boyhood in Martha's Vineyard, and he knew the island mentality. He said, quote, all my relatives over there hated the Kennedys. It was the old prejudice against Irish Catholics. Smith feared the consequences of a Kennedy accident occurring in, quote, enemy territory, end quote. So this is interesting. It confirms some of what we've seen before, that Kennedy's initial perspective and his group's initial perspective was that while Jim Arena was pleasant, he wasn't in their pocket. And so that gives us a little bit of the perspective of the Kennedy group. Smith calls Kenny O'Donnell. This is the second time, and O'Donnell knew only what Smith had told him. He didn't know anything else. Smith says it's a fatal. So you've got to have the registry guy there making out a report in addition to the Edgartown police. That's the key guy right there on any reckless driving charge. So they're already trying to identify who's the registry inspector, because he's going to be the one who makes the determination about whether or not there's a case that's pursued. Smith didn't know any registry people, but he did know a guy named Joe Grealish, and he ran the Hyannis office. It was no secret, Smith said, that registry problems could be, quote, fixed. So even though we've been given this picture of there's Kennedy haters down there, he's already aware that there's ways around this. We can shut this up. Leo Damore lets us know that there's a history of, if you just pay $200 to this guy, it'll get taken care of with various traffic elements or license problems. And so there is a good old boy mentality showing up here in their expectations for sure. Grealish is well connected. Smith is making his various attempts to call different people. He calls the DA, Edward Dennis, but he didn't call him immediately. By the time he does call him, he starts out breathlessly telling about the accident, and Dennis cuts him off. He says, I know all about it. I've already been called. Dennis, who is not a Kennedy man, but knows that Smith is, and he's on his staff, starts kind of ribbing Smith. He tells him, we've got your buddy this time. We're going to get an indictment off of first degree. We're going to throw the book at him. Dennis let Smith dangle for just a minute and then said, "I'm only kidding. It's just a motor vehicles accident." Here we're seeing that despite what Dennis had said initially, remember when he got the call from Edgartown and he was freaking out, now he's settled down and he says, no, the police in Edgartown have it. It's their case. Smith is now thinking about going ahead and alerting the people at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. But they were already alerted, and they had been alerted by the senator himself. Apparently the first call had been around 9:30 a.m. David Burke, who was the administrative assistant for Ted Kennedy, had received the first call. He was in Falls Church, Virginia, at around 9:30 a.m. Kennedy was calling from the public phone at the ferry landing in Chappaquiddick. Remember, the accident had happened way out across Chappie. He swam the channel to Edgartown. He slept in Edgartown. The next morning, the two guys come across, get him. They all go back on the ferry. They stop at the ferry house. And this is when apparently he called David Burke before he comes back to make his statement at the police station. So this is during that little 30-minute period in the ferry house. He calls David Burke to say he had been in an automobile accident the previous evening. It uses the word he in that, not that the car had been. Remember, we've been having this conversation of the passivity of some of the words that were used. Leo Damore is telling us that in this conversation to David Burke, Ted Kennedy called and said he'd been in an automobile accident. Despite the urging of his cousin, Joey Gargan, and Paul Markham, the accident had yet to be reported to the police. While he was fearful that his car would soon be discovered in the tidal pond beside the bridge, Kennedy was still reluctant to go to the police. So from this, we learned Gargan and Markham had both urged him. This would have been the night before. So this fits more with the movie and general understanding of this Chappaquiddick accident and less on the side of Mary Jo somehow did it, Ted Kennedy had no idea, and the next morning is when he finds out about it. This seems to indicate that he was taking ownership to David Burke, his administrative assistant. And again, just like with the police, I don't know why someone does that unless it's true. If you believe that, leave a comment explaining how you sort out this, because I don't understand why Kennedy, who's known to be a big baby who couldn't deal with things, would not just tell the police later, but would tell his own guy, his administrative assistant, I had this accident and I don't want to go to the police. That's pretty damning details for someone to share if he wasn't actually even in the car and had no connection to the physical accident at all. Burke, the administrative assistant we've been talking about, was, we're told, a Harvard graduate and the son of a Brookline, Massachusetts policeman. Burke's low, intensely urgent voice had battered down the last obstacle of Kennedy's resistance. He was able to make him understand, you have no alternative here. You have to go and report this. He urged him to report the accident as Gargan and Markham had told him to do. That part is cited specifically. This quote, he says, you've got to listen to those two guys and report this thing. Go right now. So he's urging him. Based on Ted Kennedy's movements, we could assume, I think he got through to the senator. I think he finally broke through that cloud of it'll all be fine or whatever to urge him, you've got to do the right thing. Now this is where there's another name similarity. David Burke is his administrative assistant. Burke Marshall, you might remember, is the name of the lawyer who they will try to be reaching out to later about whether or not he'll approve the statement. So David Burke, both spelled the same, B-U-R-K-E. David Burke is his assistant. Burke Marshall is the lawyer that they're trying to get input from. So Kennedy asks David Burke, his assistant, to locate Burke Marshall and get him to stand by. He also says you're going to expect a deluge of requests for information about this incident. Burke calls into the office. Remember, he's out in Falls Church, Virginia. He calls into the office to let the press secretary, Dick Drayne, know that, quote, the boss went off a bridge on Martha's Vineyard and one of Bobby's secretaries got killed, end quote. Now that quote is cited. So the fact that he's already saying the boss went off a bridge and not the boss's car was off a bridge or whatever does give credence to the way that Leo Damore summarized that earlier conversation, that this was Burke's understanding of what had happened, that the boss went off a bridge. So that's clarifying for me. So what time was this? We could guess around 9:45, right? Drayne was in the middle of a magazine interview. Anything wrong? The interviewer asked. No, nothing really, a shaken Drayne replied. This is the first of many evasions, half-truths, and lies he may have to tell for the boss over the next few days. The next time Senator Kennedy called the office, Drayne could tell he was very upset, very depressed, but he could still come up with answers. And so Drayne is pumping him for information so that he'll know what's happened. Some of the answers were the stuff of which a major scandal could be made. The accident had occurred on a dirt road, late at night, following a party for a group of young women, and gone unreported for 10 hours. Now, we've talked about this again. This is the most serious of all of it, that had he reported right away, he'd still have to clean up the mess of the surrounding details of the accident. But this is what makes the accident rise up to a level that's going to cost him the presidency. The senator wanted no information about the accident given to the press. So Drayne sits there all morning. You can just imagine this. Someone who, a press secretary, develops a closer relationship with reporters, obviously, than the rest of the staff. And so they have to walk this line of being on the side of ultimately the candidate, but developing relationships of trust and kind of camaraderie with the press pool that is interested in whatever's going on with their candidate. And so he knows, I'm sitting here with this massive story, and they start coming in saying a former Kennedy secretary has been drowned. But of course, he knows what they don't, which is that Ted Kennedy was the one driving the car. He says, and I could only give them what had already been made public. So he is in a tightrope situation where he knows way more information and has to carefully guard his words, and yet has to appear like he's being completely forthright so that they move away from the story and go on and don't hound him more. That'd be a hard position to be in. I woke up pretty sleepy this morning, so I'm having my tea. Burke makes his way into the office, and the senator is calling several times from the police station now. So he's writing the report. The first thing he wants is the phone number of the accident victim's parents so that they could be notified of her death. Burke comes up with the number for Joseph and Gwen Kopechne, and the senator calls around 10 a.m. He asks to speak to her husband, but she could already sense the sadness in his voice, or a sorrow, just in the way his voice came across the telephone. She said, Kennedy reported Mary Jo was in an accident. Was it in a car? Mrs. Kopechne asks. It was an automobile accident, he said. Mary Jo was returning to take a ferry back to the mainland when the accident occurred. And let's just look at the map, remind you. Number one, he's already told multiple people this morning that he was the one driving. So whatever you believe, he'd already told others he was driving. But second, remember, the accident is way out on one end of the island. Ferry was on this way. She wasn't on her way to the ferry. Whatever was happening, that's just not true. And in the second sentence he tells her family about her passing, he's already lying and obfuscating. Mrs. Kopechne asked if her daughter had been killed. Kennedy hesitated and then said, yes. The senator gave her no details, she said later. Quote, he just told me what happened and I broke down. I remember screaming, I'm alone here. From then on, I don't remember anything. I must have let out some awful noises. A neighbor was outside hanging clothes. I must have let her in because I had the doors locked. She tried to get me to tell her what had happened. So she's alone. She gets this call. It's already lies. She's believing wrongly. And you'll notice at no point in that conversation did he mention that he was the driver. At no point in that conversation did he mention that it was his car. And it's lies. We know by the timing that Huck Look had seen them after the ferry had already gone for the last time. And also they were in the opposite direction from where the ferry was. So there's so many issues here just in this one very short conversation. But he has lied to Mary Jo's mother from the very beginning. Burke Marshall, this is the lawyer Burke Marshall, he was in Waltham, Massachusetts that morning. He was preparing archives for a proposed JFK Memorial Library when he gets the call for help from Ted Kennedy's office. He was described as, quote, a man of incorruptible character and strong moral convictions, end quote. So we're being given a picture here of someone who's a great man, someone who's a truth teller, who is honorable. Marshall had been selected by Robert Kennedy to head the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in 1961. So he had served in Kennedy's administration. Marshall had diffused an explosive racial confrontation in Birmingham, Alabama, following a campaign led by Martin Luther King. Of him, Robert Kennedy said, quote, Burke Marshall has the world's best judgment on anything, end quote. So we have been given a picture of a man who is high in character, high in truth-telling and reliability and excellent judgment. This was someone that Robert Kennedy relied on. Marshall agrees, quote, to help wherever I can, end quote. And so he goes ahead and hops in his car and starts a 2-hour drive out to the Cape. Marshall was already at the compound when Kennedy arrived, quote, so upset. The question really was where to begin. So I want to just point out, this is a first-hand account of Ted Kennedy's state at around, we aren't given an exact time, but this would have been after Ted Kennedy leaves the police station, is on that sweaty flight we read about where his whole back was covered in perspiration. And he's been just repeating, how did this happen? How I can't believe that this happened, over and over again. He's at the compound when Kennedy arrives. So this is the Ted Kennedy that he's meeting. And this is a first-hand account of Ted Kennedy's state. Marshall found Ted Kennedy, quote, obviously disoriented, but he appeared coherent, end quote. Kennedy said he had not reported the accident for some 10 hours because he was convinced that Mary Jo had somehow gotten out of the car and survived the accident. So this is the first time we're hearing of this reasoning from Ted Kennedy. This is a potential reason that we should keep in mind. You know, did he actually think maybe Mary Jo slipped out? Let's see in the morning where things are. Is that really what he thought? We don't know, but that's what he tells Burke Marshall. Quote, I don't think he shook that idea for a while, Marshall said. It says after he was with Ted Kennedy for a time, Marshall came to the conclusion that Ted had suffered a, quote, blockage. He said, quote, a lot of his mind wasn't accepting yet what was happening to him, end quote. So let's just remember what we've just been told about this man, that this credible source thinks this is what has happened. This is the man who RFK says has, quote, the world's best judgment, end quote. So this man with great judgment, according to RFK, so do with that what you will, says he thinks Ted Kennedy is like in a state of denial. Like he can't even intake and absorb what's actually happened. Marshall reads over the copy of the senator's report that had been turned in. Member Markham had a copy, and he brought it back with them from Edgartown. And Marshall had been an antitrust lawyer. He had been vice president and general counsel for IBM. But he did not know criminal codes and motor vehicle statutes for the state of Massachusetts. You might know, but lawyers kind of study generally when they're in law school, but then they get really familiar with one particular stream of information, whether it's, real estate law, tax codes. They learn one particular frame of legal code very, very well. And so he was a great lawyer. He knew his stuff, and yet he doesn't know the motor vehicle codes of Massachusetts, which every few years is updating and changing too. So only someone in that stream would be familiar with all the particulars. Marshall is the one who had Markham call the police chief to postpone release of the statement, but the statement had already been made public. We read that in the last episode. However, in that conversation, he learns that Arena is loath to press charges. So that's a relief to him. Marshall instructs the senator, do not answer any questions about the accident, publicly or privately. Quote, the reason I thought he shouldn't make a statement to the press was that I didn't know enough about his legal situation. In addition, Damore tells us, Marshall was concerned that Kennedy could break down at a press conference. He sees his state and he thinks this guy couldn't probably make it through a press conference right now. He, quote, truly did not know whether he might have a medical problem. So Marshall is looking at the situation, determining that he's in some state of blockage, and just urges him, do not answer any questions and don't do a press conference. It's not time for that. And we're being told his motivation for that was, I don't know his legal status. He might break down, and I really don't know if he has a medical problem. These are apparently his motivations. Marshall advises Kennedy to see a doctor. And the Kennedy family physician on Cape Cod is named Dr. Robert Watt. He was brought out to Hyannisport, and the senator tells him he had been in an automobile accident. There was a lapse in his memory from the time of hitting Dyke Bridge and struggling to get out of the submerged car. Here's the description. This is the closest description we have yet to what Ted Kennedy's perspective on the accident was, supposedly. So let's listen carefully. There was a lapse in his memory from hitting Dyke Bridge and struggling to get out of the submerged car. At the last moment, he had grabbed the side of an open window and pulled himself out. He remembered diving repeatedly to get a passenger out of the car without success, going for help, and returning to the accident scene. Again, efforts to rescue the passenger failed. Kennedy was driven to the ferry slip and swam to Edgartown. Returning to his hotel room, he had slept fitfully until 7 a.m. the next morning. So a few observations just about that telling. It says hitting Dyke Bridge. So he is, in his statement at least, claiming that he was still in the car at that point. Struggling to get out of the submerged car. So this is not a picture of, I know diver Farrar at one point posited that perhaps the car had bobbed for just a second and that could have been the time when Ted Kennedy hopped out of the window. But that's not what he is saying here in this statement. He is saying struggling to get out of the submerged car. So his telling is that he was in the submerged car. He says at the last moment he grabbed the side of an open window. So that answers our question a little bit, that there was an open window at the time when the car hit the water, and that's what he went out, which fits. I'll tell you, I've read a bit more. I'm a little bit ahead now, and it was described as a super hot, muggy night. And so the windows would be open. That makes sense. We are told that he dove repeatedly. They returned to the accident scene. Again, efforts to rescue Mary Jo failed. And then that he's driven and he swims. So all of those details are repeated here. The doctor notices a half-inch scrape above the right ear, a bruise with spongy swelling at the top of the senator's head, and a muscle spasm in an area about the nape of the neck. He diagnoses concussion, contusions, and abrasion of the scalp, and acute cervical strain. His determination of concussion was predicated, quote, upon objective evidence of injury and the history of the temporary loss of consciousness and retrograde amnesia. Impairment of judgment and confused behavior are symptoms consistent with an injury of the character sustained by the patient, end quote. Watt then does prescribe a sedative to relieve the headache, neck pain, and general soreness that Senator Kennedy complained of. Later, criticized that sedation was contraindicated in case of concussion, Watt said he'd been misquoted. But I wouldn't say he didn't get a sedative. He revealed that he had prescribed an oral muscle relaxant, heat, and bed rest. And he qualified his diagnosis. He said Kennedy had sustained, quote, a mild concussion, was bruised and shaken up. He had received a, quote, blow on the head, but he was all right. So we're at the end of chapter 8. One of the observations that I had was just that this is a different world than the one that you and I inhabit. If we had gone off a bridge, if we had failed to report it and that led to someone's death, there wouldn't be jokes inside the legal offices about, oh, we're going to get him this time. There would be no boys club guarding you or guarding me or offering to hold back the statement on our behalf. And yes, on the one hand, you could say this is an important personage and maybe anyone would try to defer, but this is not equal justice. Even the inner office banter is something that shows this is a different handling of this case than it would be if it was you or I. Another observation from this chapter is that he indicates that Gargan and Markham did urge him to report. Finally, he listens to Burke, his administrative assistant. We got much more of a look at Ted Kennedy's movements, attitude, and mental state, and it seems more credible because it's through the lens of Burke Marshall, this lawyer who RFK said had the world's best judgment. And so in this guy's eyes, Senator Kennedy is in a place of distancing himself from the situation and not yet accepting it. And I will say that for me, the other observation I have is that the concussion and the injury seems more credible than I initially believed in this case. This does not sound utterly ridiculous. There's an abrasion, there's a bruise with spongy swelling, there's a muscle spasm, and he's also clearly in a state of confusion and agitation when they meet him. Now, you and I know that he had a whole period of hours of pretense. He got himself together with his little deck shoes. He went across and had a cheery hi to the ferry worker. And so they don't know that, though. Burke Marshall doesn't know that. The doctor doesn't know that. And so from their perspective, the diagnosis that he makes doesn't seem as incredible and out of the realm of possibility as I initially thought it would have had to have been. I've kind of had the perspective that, oh, they just got a Kennedy doctor and he just kind of made something up. His own words indicate that he saw certain signs that led him to the diagnosis that he made. So I think it's important that we be objective and that we don't come into this with the perspective of Ted Kennedy's a rotten, dirty liar, and no matter what, nothing he says is good, nothing the Kennedy compound does is good, nothing the Kennedy people say are good, none of the Kennedy people are good at all. We can't trust any of their perspectives because they're all just the worst. I don't think that serves us well. And I think at least trying to lean on, hey, this guy was known for good judgment, or this doctor saw these signs of potential injury. I think it's important that we go ahead and take those to heart. Okay, chapter 9. Other medical authorities found Watts's concussion diagnosis far-fetched. In that same interview, Watt admitted that part of his diagnosis about Kennedy's post-accident memory loss had been based, quote, simply on what Kennedy told him, end quote. Another medical source familiar with the case said that this conclusion was open to questions because, quote, it seems to be stretching the facts to fit the diagnosis, end quote. Leo Damore points out for us that retrograde amnesia, impairment of judgment, and confused behavior were symptoms identical in all respects to yet another, quote, malady, intoxication by alcohol. So Leo Damore is putting forward his thought that did the doctor even consider perhaps the reason he didn't remember anything has nothing to do with a concussion and has more to do with the fact that he was impaired at the time. Watts's examination also did not confirm severe physiological shock that would have caused Senator Kennedy to delay reporting the accident for more than 9 hours. He didn't have some sort of physical injury. He wasn't passed out on the side of the beach. He didn't hit his head on the windshield, and therefore you could expect some temporary short-term amnesia. That's not the case. So Hyannisport is now mobilizing for action. Ted Kennedy had called Rose Kennedy from the police station. That was one of the phone calls he made there, and let her know that he had been in an automobile accident. And so Rose Kennedy was advised now to cancel a scheduled appearance at the annual St. Francis Xavier Church Bazaar. She is the one, Mrs. Kennedy is the one who notified her daughter, Jean, and son-in-law, Stephen Smith. They were vacationing in Spain at the time. She also notified Patricia Kennedy Lawford out in California and Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who was in Paris. Her husband was then serving as the U.S. ambassador to France. Ethel, Bobby's widow, had presided at a Special Olympics at the University of Connecticut that morning. She returned to Hyannisport around 2 o'clock. And she then calls former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who was a key figure in Jack Kennedy's administration, telling him, quote, "Come up here, Bob. There's nobody here but women," end quote. I don't know who she means, because the things that we know, I'm guessing she means of the Kennedy insiders, maybe, that there's Ethel, Rose. I don't know who else she means. We've been told about other men who are descending on the compound and who were already there, so I don't get it. I don't understand. If you know, if there's some other list of Kennedy women who were there, or maybe other women who were there, or is this a joke? Like, is she saying they're all a bunch of sissies? I don't fully get what she's saying. If you know, would you leave it in the comments? The chief of police in their area is advised to beef up barriers around Hyannisport, that there's going to be increased activity. And so barricades go up, and they've closed off the avenue that leads to the Kennedy compound so that there's a little more control over who can get to that area. David Burke, remember Ted Kennedy's administrative assistant in D.C., he alerted Dun Gifford at his family's summer home on nearby Nantucket Island. He was a legislative aide in Kennedy's office, and he immediately arranges to island hop to Martha's Vineyard. His chartered plane dipped over Dyke Bridge in Chappaquiddick. He sees the senator's car submerged in Poocha Pond. He landed at the Edgartown airport around 11 o'clock, and Gifford calls Senator Kennedy first. He was still at the police station, so around 11, Kennedy is still at the police station. He corroborates the instructions that David Burke had given him. He takes a taxi to Martha's Vineyard Funeral Home in Vineyard Haven. So he arrives at the Edgartown airport and then gets over to Martha's Vineyard, to the funeral home. Gifford walks into the mortician's office. Remember, Eugene Free, he is the one who had observed Dr. Mills, the medical examiner, as he did the initial look at Mary Jo Kopechne's body. In the last chapter, that's what we saw him doing, waiting to find out about embalming the body. Well, he walks into Free's office. He introduces himself as an aide on Senator Kennedy's staff and announced he was available to help in any way that makes sense in making funeral arrangements. Free, we're told, was annoyed at the intrusion And he tells Gifford, quote, "You have no authority as far as I'm concerned. I'm taking all my orders from the Keelty Funeral Home," end quote. Free would not allow Gifford to go down to the basement preparation room to identify the body. When Gifford asked to use the phone, however, Free did accommodate that request. And Gifford then calls back to Washington to the senator's office to check for more instructions. He was told again, do whatever you can to expedite the paperwork required to get Mary Jo Kopechne's body off the island as fast as possible. Gifford also learned that the other young women who had attended the party were being hustled off Martha's Vineyard on a 3:00 ferry. Free has on his desk a copy of the record of death, certifying that Mary Jo Kopechne had died, quote, of asphyxiation by immersion, parentheses, overturned submerged automobile, close parentheses, end quote. So Gifford asks what that means. Drowning, Free said. Dr. Mills made the finding. But Free was already beginning to doubt the validity of the medical examiner's diagnosis. The lack of water, remember when he places the block in the diaphragm, he expects a lot of water to come out and he gets about a teacup. On page 17, we had been told, Emperor Free was watching, that every time Dr. Mills, quote, tapped the chest, water welled up. So he had observed that. He had placed the block and seen the teacup of water that came out. And he feels that there just hasn't been enough water. He thinks it's, quote, unusual for a drowning case. He begins to wonder if Mary Jo might not have suffocated to death. He suggested that Dr. Mills should change his finding, but the medical examiner told him he, quote, didn't want to cause any problem, end quote. Mills was not going to make an independent decision about the autopsy, we remember, and Free proposes that his assistant should run down and catch Dr. Mills in his office and have him sign the death certificate. Gifford wants to come along and Free can't say no. So Dr. Mills had begun office hours at 2:15, but had scarcely been able to treat a waiting room full of patients because he's constantly interrupted by the telephone. There's nonstop questions about the accident in Chappaquiddick. The first call was from medical examiner Dr. Robert Nevin. The reporters are here, Dawn. Tell me what to tell them. By 3:30, inquiries were coming in from all over the country, and Mills's wife said, I'm going down to the police chief to find out what on earth is going on. Returning to the office a short time later, she passed her husband a note. Senator Kennedy was the driver of the car. So this puts him in high alert. He hadn't known this information, and Mills feels very glad that he had reported the case as fully as possible to the DA's office and had asked about an autopsy. He calls the police chief now and says, what do I do, chief? He's getting a lot of pressure to order an autopsy, and Arena is under pressure. Arena says, if the DA wants to do it or it's up to you, okay. But if you don't think it's necessary, don't do it. Arena's perception of that conversation was that, quote, Mills was looking for support or something. So his perception, which probably is right because we're given this information that he had been passed a note, and so all of a sudden he's on high alert. He's kind of in a state of like, oh, I'm glad I told the DA. Oh, I'm glad I went ahead and said if they want to do an autopsy, they could. And now he's calling the police chief. So it seems accurate that Mills is kind of like, hey, what do I do? Like anything you need from me? Like how would it make, I want to make sure I cover all my bases. Mills had mistook Dun Gifford for a reporter when he had showed up in his office with a death certificate. So this is the medical examiner, and Dun Gifford is there now. This is the Kennedy man. He's now with Mills, the medical examiner. Gifford asks him if an autopsy had to be performed before the body of Mary Jo Kopechne could be released for burial. But Mills thinks this is a reporter asking him. Mills answers the DA's office had left the decision to him, and he was satisfied that the cause of death was accidental drowning. So by the time Gifford gets back to the funeral home, Free had arranged for the air services to transport the body to Wilkes-Barre the following morning. Free could have shipped the body out that night, but held off. He says, quote, I still felt that Dr. Mills might change his mind and order an autopsy, or that someone in higher authority might direct the autopsy to be done. I just want to stop here and say that they are each waiting for somebody else to make the call. Mills doesn't quite know, and so he's calling the police chief for affirmation. The police chief is like, well, if you want to do it, or if the DA wants to do it, it's up to you. That's fine. If not, if you don't want to, then don't do it. So Arena passes the buck back to him. Mills is kind of trying to feel people out, like, what should I do? Free doesn't have authority, but he does what he can do, but then he's waiting. Each of them is kind of waiting for someone else to take the lumps, waiting for somebody else to make the hard decisions. And I do think that even though we're even seeing people working together for a common purpose of altering or manipulating a situation or the perception of a situation, and that certainly does happen, and I'm not arguing that those things don't happen, I will say that sometimes cover-ups happen like this. Sometimes it's just weak or uncertain or stressed out people who just kind of roll over and don't make a decision. It's not always only this big scary they who's keeping it from happening, and this guy called this guy, and so he said, no way is an autopsy going to be done on my watch. We don't see that happening here. What we see is kind of people who are a little unsure of themselves, a little humble, a little thoughtful, want to make sure they feel out the right people, but no one steps up and just says, you know what, let's just go ahead and do it. Now, they did get that input when Walter Steele called. He said, when in doubt, do it. But the medical examiner pushed back and thought, the diagnosis is good. So the DA's office had tried to kind of exert a little bit of pressure. But ultimately, sometimes it's just a couple of key people who lack the moral fortitude to make a hard decision in the trajectory of what's right. And I think that's what's happening here. You guys let me know what you think. I don't see conspiracy cover-up. I don't see this guy got to this one and this one got to this one. I see a medical examiner who made his diagnosis and clear through the afternoon didn't even realize that Ted Kennedy was connected at all. That's what we're being told. So that gives us a picture that I think is worth contemplating. This isn't some big ugly cover-up. It's kind of in action. Gifford goes to town hall and introduces himself to Chief Arena and explains, I've come up here to help things along. Arena knew of nothing standing in the way of releasing the body, and he didn't question Gifford. He took his word that he was a representative for Senator Kennedy. Arena had heard no word from Burke Marshall, the lawyer, or anybody else about the accident. This silence intensifies the pressure that he feels. He, throughout the afternoon, is just getting worn down by reporters wanting more and more and more information. And doubts are gathering around the senator's accident report, which of course they would, because we remember even Arena and the first few eyeballs that read this statement thought, there's holes all over the place. Well, now reporters who are trained to dig and find holes are going, hey, what about this? What about this? How, they're asking their questions. He's still expecting to hear from Kennedy's guys. He is also going back to Walter Steele and others and trying to make sure that he's legally doing the right thing. He says that they kept asking themselves honestly, what have we got here? What are we going to get hit with? What needs to happen? And he indicates that he was not sweeping the case under the rug. He says, quote, there was no effort by anyone to say, let's get Ted Kennedy or let's take care of him. So he's completely denying that there was bias on either side of the case. We're going to get him. We're going to help him out here. A manslaughter charge was mandatory in Massachusetts in cases where a driver left the scene of a fatal accident if negligence was proved. Arena said, quote, we talked about manslaughter. We even looked up the wording in the statutes, and you had to have wanton, reckless, and willful conduct, end quote. This is the legal equivalent of intentional conduct involving a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm would result to another. However, the mere happening of an accident where the circumstances immediately preceding it were left to conjecture was not sufficient to prove negligence on the part of the driver. For these reasons, Arena did not think he had cause to make such a serious charge. He had found no evidence of negligence from his examination at the accident scene. Walter Steele could have told him that driving a car off a bridge was a prima facie case of negligence. But even still, Steele was convinced, quote, that there was absolutely no evidence for a manslaughter charge, end quote. Steele would say later, I really should have known better. If I had to do it over again, I would have held out for probable cause hearing for a manslaughter and pushed for an autopsy, end quote. Steele was sure that no judge would have found probable cause, but he says, quote, it would have wiped out a lot of doubts, end quote. So in hindsight, he says, we should have at least covered ourselves by trying for it, and then the judge could have struck it down, and then it would have been clearly done through the executive branch, and then the judicial branch would have gone ahead and put that down. But instead, the entire buck is on the executive side. Arena, too, would eventually conclude that he had made a mistake. Quote, a state trooper friend of mine in the traffic bureau said to me, you really could have gotten Kennedy on involuntary manslaughter, the taking of another's life by an act not performed. And that's probably true, end quote. Leo Damore tells us, with no evidence of negligence, nor witnesses to testify to recklessness, inattention, speed, or drunk driving, Arena did not believe that he could make a lesser charge stick. That left one option, quote, leaving the scene, end quote. That was basically a hit and run accident. The offense seemed clear enough from Kennedy's admission that he had delayed nearly 10 hours before reporting the accident. But Arena hesitates to even pursue this charge. Because Arena had treated Ted Kennedy in such a solicitous manner and failed to interrogate the senator, it left him with a single piece of evidence, but one which was indispensable to the case, the senator's own statement. There was no presumption under Massachusetts law that the owner of the automobile would have been involved in the accident or would have been the driver. No statute commanded a passenger to report an accident. So Leo Damore tells us, had Kennedy denied knowledge of the event, or had he said that Mary Jo Kopechne was driving the car, Arena would have had to accept that story since there were no witnesses to the accident. So I'm left again with the idea of, why didn't he report it then? Why did he claim that? It doesn't make sense to me. So Arena starts drawing up the traffic violation, and for this charge, the operator of the vehicle would be punished by imprisonment for not less than 2 months or more than 2 years. So we've got a little bit of jail time on the horizon if this charge sticks. To complete the citation, though, Arena needed to know Ted Kennedy's driver's license number and the expiration date. And since the senator had been unable to produce a license at the police station, Arena calls the registry office in Oak Bluffs. He was told, quote, we don't have the license information yet. We'll get back to you, end quote. Inspector George Kennedy was being deliberately evasive. So here we see someone who is in an official capacity and yet deliberately being evasive. So this is different than the other situations that we've seen so far. At 4:10 p.m., David Burke, the administrative assistant in Washington, had telephoned him to report that he couldn't find Senator Kennedy's license in his Washington car. Inspector Kennedy called registry headquarters in Boston to request a license check for date of birth 2/22/32, Edward M. Kennedy. The registry file room starts to be looked for, and these cards are kept in alphabetical order. The application is what's kept in the files, not a copy of the license. And this person, Joseph Molino, finds a white duplicate card that had been issued in 1968 for a lost license, valid until February 22, 1969. Molino did not realize that the expired license in his hand belonged to a United States senator. He said, quote, I'd always thought of him as Senator Ted Kennedy, not Edward Kennedy. So I didn't make the connection until the next day when I read about the accident and realized which Kennedy it was. So this person at the registry office finds the application for a 5-month expired license and has pulled it and gotten that information back, but doesn't even realize it until the next day. Inspector Kennedy So this is Red Kennedy, remember. He's been on the scene since the early hours of the accident being found. Disturbed to learn that the senator had been driving on an expired license at the time of his accident, Inspector Kennedy was less complacent about the infraction than Irina was about the senator's lack of a driver's license at the police station. The inspector calls Joe Grealish, and remember, Joe Grealish is the Kennedy friend that had been preemptively reached out to by the Hyannisport group. He was the regional head of the motor vehicles for southeastern Massachusetts, and he wielded authority over all district supervisors. Grealish orders Kennedy to give no information about the expired license to anyone, including Police Chief Irina. To conceal important information from investigating authorities was highly irregular. Damore tells us, nevertheless, Kennedy agreed to stall Irina about license information, and he hoped the police chief didn't run a check at registry headquarters himself. Grealish tracks Registrar McLaughlin to his summer house and told him to handle the Kennedy accident as routine vehicular fatality. McLaughlin says, quote, "We get 800 to 1,000 of these cases each year. This is just another one. Don't do anything different because of who he is," end quote. McLaughlin changed his mind, however, when Grealish told him that Senator Kennedy's license had expired. Now he orders Grealish to take over the case personally, quote, so it doesn't get screwed up. My observations for Chapter 9 are that now we're told that Dr. Watts's diagnosis was in part based on Ted Kennedy's words and story. So that's problematic. Number 2, Dun Gifford, who's a Kennedy henchman, he's on the scene. He literally flew above the bridge and saw the car by the bridge. He's the one who went into the mortician and then to the medical examiner, and he's trying to shepherd the body off the island. 3, Irina is now weighing manslaughter and other charges. He's taken it a bit more seriously and kind of realizing the importance. The mounting question I have is, why did Ted Kennedy admit and report it? I think we can't get away from the fact that he did this and that the things that he said to others, including the lawyer, seem to fit right together with that he was the one that drove the car. But even still, if he had said it was Mary Jo Kopechne, he would have been off the hook. We note that his license was 5 months expired and therefore he didn't have a copy of it. We see both things happening. That yes, the Kennedy machine, there are some people like Grealish who are now proactively trying to manipulate and cover information. But we also see that just inaction and slow decision making is part of this whole series of a failure in justice. So it's both. There is a little bit of cover-up happening now. We start to see someone deliberately say, do not give information to anyone. And we also see that Dr. Mills didn't even know, and he's just trying to make his best guess judgment about what needs to happen. Okay, we're going to go ahead and try to get through Chapter 10 as well. Chapter 10. Mills was being challenged by reporters about the lack of an autopsy in the case, and by 5 o'clock he was pushed to the point of irrationality and blackout. As I tried my best to answer a barrage of questions, it got into such a chaotic state. So he calls George Killen, trying to ask for help. Quote, "I'm being swamped with calls from newspapers all over the country. What do I tell these people?" Killen snaps back at him. "Tell them the girl died of accidental drowning and don't say anything else. And if they persist, slam down the receiver." So Killen is like, be hard-nosed about this. Don't give them more information. Killen was being hounded himself. One call had come in from his friend who was a former DA called Frank Keating. He was calling to verify reports of this accident with Ted Kennedy. "Yes, it's true," Killen said. "And the girl was killed? She drowned." Dr. Mills had already called Killen 3 times about the case, and I told him that Killen says his counsel was, quote, "If you want an autopsy, let me know and we'll get a pathologist." I left that strictly up to him. I asked if he was satisfied with the cause of death, and he said he was. Keating, this colleague, says, "What a lucky SOB Eddie Dennis is. He's got a United States Senator in the palm of his hand. He's got Teddy Kennedy for manslaughter. Killen sputtered in protest. Where's the manslaughter? Where's evidence of negligence? Keating says, if Ted Kennedy was driving that car when it went off the bridge, there's no question of negligence about that, is there, George? Killen knew better than to argue criminal law with this guy, and he says, well, what do you know about this case? I don't know anything, Keating said. Well, nobody does at this point. So that's how that conversation goes. But each of these men, we can imagine their awareness of the legal implications is mounting. Eugene Free then was not surprised to hear from Killen. He was expecting the DA's office to hold for autopsy, right? He's expecting them to call and say, go ahead and hold off on embalming. Instead, Killen wanted to know the scheduled departure time, and he verified that a blood sample had been taken. So even after this conversation has happened, Killen is still business as usual. Body's going to go. Have you gotten the blood sample? Dun Gifford has called the funeral home, asked if there's anything else he can do to help with arrangements. So he is still faithfully shepherding this body. Gifford had a busy day on the island. He had seen the young women off the ferry at Vineyard Haven. This is actually a bit later at the time of the inquest, but this is what these 5 women who had been at this party with Mary Jo looked like. He had seen the young women off the ferry at Vineyard Haven with the assurance that he would also escort the body of Mary Jo Kopechne to Pennsylvania the next morning. Before he flew back to Nantucket, he reports back to David Burke, and now David Burke is at Hyannisport. We're told that Burke had flown to Boston late in the afternoon. A reporter on board had recognized him, took the seat beside him. Reports of Senator Kennedy's accident on newswires were contradictory and incomplete, the reporter said. Quote, don't you think you should make some kind of full disclosure soon? End quote. But Burke was offended. I don't think we're going to do that. The senator is not in good shape, he said. I'm going to go up there and maybe sit under a tree with him, and then we'll have to see. But keeping a lid on this story was impossible. Before he had left Washington, we're told that Burke had dispatched another man, William Vandal Huevel, to handhold the grieving parents. He was a former Justice Department lawyer, and he had traveled with Robert Kennedy during the presidential campaign. He arrived at the modest first-floor apartment in a 2-family house too late to prevent the Kopechnes from talking to reporters. Here are some of the things that they had already said to reporters. Joe Kopechne, who was a well-spoken, good-looking insurance salesman, had said that his wife had lapsed into shock right after Senator Kennedy had telephoned with news of their daughter's death. Ethel Kennedy had also called. He said, quote, she talked about faith, how it could help. She said, we will be at the funeral. No one at the Kennedy compound had volunteered any information about the accident. And Kopechne had told a Boston Globe reporter, quote, nothing was explained. We still don't have any real details of what happened. Kopechne didn't know what to make of the wire service story containing Kennedy's report of the accident. When this reporter reads him over the telephone what Senator Kennedy had said, quote, we didn't even know she was with Kennedy. That kind of upset us. There we were, the last to know. Yeah, it is appalling. And it's wrong, the position that Senator Kennedy put them in. The senator had neglected to say he was the driver of the accident car when he had called to report that Mary Jo had been killed. And Kopechne finds Kennedy's evasiveness baffling and frustrating. He expected candor in a moment like this, and what he got was a sliver of information, and later details are leaking. They had known about Mary Jo's trip to Martha's Vineyard with several other young women. He said, quote, we assume the girls went to the island to see the regatta with the senator, but we're not certain. Mary Jo loved sailing. She went sailing at the Kennedy place up on Cape Cod. Ted had invited her up with some other girls right after Senator Robert Kennedy was killed. So he's talking about that initial boiler room party that had happened the summer before, almost a year exactly prior to this one. Kopechne said that Mary Jo was almost one of the Kennedys, that she was wrapped up with the Kennedys. Quote, politics was her life. She didn't seem to have any time for anything much outside of politics. She wasn't engaged or anything like that. And Gwen Kopechne said, it was a good career working with the politicians. It was what she wanted to do. She would have been 29 years old next Saturday, end quote. And I just want to point out, clearly these people have concern and love for Mary Jo. He is a total dad saying she's not engaged. That would have been top priority for an almost 29-year-old woman at this time. He's her dad. He's seeing her through that lens. And she's mom. She's talking about her birthday. But they both are talking about she was doing what she loved. This was what she breathed to do. She loved this work. I want to point you to the episode that we did about Mary Jo Kopechne in our Ask Not series. I'll link that in the comments below. But one of the things that we learned about Mary Jo was her background, the things that she cared about, the education she received, and why she ended up in this position at all. She had a business degree, and she had gone to work in Robert Kennedy's office when he was elected to the Senate in 1964. In December, though, she had been hired by kind of a consulting firm. The person who had hired her confirmed she left on Thursday and said she wouldn't be back until Tuesday morning. She wanted to spend the long weekend on Cape Cod with friends she had made while on Bobby's staff. Mary Jo had never worked for Ted Kennedy, Mrs. Kopechne said. He just entertained them up there at Hyannisport. And after Robert Kennedy was killed, Ted Kennedy seemed to be trying to hang on to his brother's staff. So Mrs. Kopechne is giving a plain-spoken report of her understanding of the situation. Mary Jo had never worked for him. He was entertaining them, and he seemed to be trying to hold on to his brother's staff. This is a good observation on her part. This is probably what was happening. Mrs. Kopechne had spoken to her daughter on Tuesday about the regatta. We were talking on the telephone. I said, honey, be careful of the water. She said to me, Mother, you know me. I only like to sunbathe. This brought up, of course, the question for me was she not a strong swimmer? Is that why her mom is warning her like this? We know that she had been out on the Cape before. We know that she had gone sailing, and even there's mention of them having swum. So I don't fully understand. I still don't understand her comfort level with swimming. Commenters have pointed out, though, that at the time of the accident, she would have been in black water, and being upside down would have made it even more disorienting. And then the position of the car, which I'll put here, means that she would have had to have swum downward, felt in the various windows, and it would have been incredibly disorienting to try to figure out where she was, her body position, and then which way she should swim to get up to the top. So even if she was a strong swimmer, those things would be confusing, and particularly if she had somehow bumped her head or had been feeling tipsy and woozy, or perhaps had been asleep in the back seat or something like that when the accident had happened. All these things would have contributed to her disorientation in that moment. So while I do want to know about whether or not she was a good swimmer, it's not the only issue at work in that moment when she's under the water. Mary Jo Kopechne had shared a house in Georgetown with 3 young women. One of them was also a boiler room girl, Nance Lyons. She was at this party. Her housemates were reluctant to talk about her. That the Kopechnes had tipped off the press about a weekend party on Martha's Vineyard was bringing reporters down on Drayne's head. Remember, this is Ted Kennedy's press secretary. And no one before the report to Chief Arena, and then also the questioning that had been done to Dick Drayne, at no point before it was the party mentioned. And now the party is mentioned by Kopechne's parents. This was powder keg information, bound to hurt the senator if it wasn't diffused fast. Drayne tried to lift the stigma a little bit. Mary Jo Kopechne was one of 8 young women invited for a reunion of former campaign workers. So he's trying to distance it from Ted Kennedy. Ted just came by to thank the girls for their work with Bobby. Then this one girl had to leave, he said. They were trying to catch a ferry when the accident happened. Well, we know that's a lie, but he is trying to diffuse the stigma and kind of stop this. What? Ted Kennedy was in the accident after it was a party with a bunch of girls. He's married to this other lady. What is happening? He's trying to tamp down the concerns that are being raised by this information, right? The party guests had included people who had participated in the regatta. Paul Markham was one. We've seen him all morning, right, with Kennedy. Kennedy's cousin, Joey Gargan, he was the one who had leased the cottage and was part of that conversation in the ferry house. And Jack Crimmins, quote, friend and longtime political aide to Senator Kennedy. But actually, he was basically the chauffeur, and he did it for weekends and evenings for Senator Kennedy. Damore writes, the presence of the senator's chauffeur at the party begged more questions than Drayne had answers for. The most obvious one was, why had Ted Kennedy driven himself to the ferry when his chauffeur was at the party? It's an excellent question. Drayne suggested that the senator's wife had planned to fly to Edgartown on Sunday and sail back to the mainland with her husband. The truth was otherwise. She had not even been invited to the regatta weekend. So he's lying in almost every word that he's saying, but he is trying to complete that goal of removing some of the stigma. That was an exact quote of his own goals. That Senator Kennedy made no mention of the party, quote, really bothered, end quote, Chief Arena. He said, that's one thing I objected to, that I had to hear about it from reporters. When I found out there had been a party and everybody had left the island, I really got put on the spot. I mean, y'all, he can only be angry at himself. He's the one who had the senator right there, and he failed to ask questions. In fact, he hustled him out the back door. So the failure to have these questions is on himself. He's angry at Ted, like, why weren't you honest with me, man? Like, we had a bro code going on. But there was no bro code. Senator Kennedy had no allegiance to Chief Arena, and Chief Arena should not have had the assumption of goodwill from the senator. He had no reason to think well of the senator's intentions in this moment. Arena defended his ignorance as best he could. Quote, I know nothing of any party. It's only a rumor, he said. Nobody has proven to me anyone connected with Kennedy was there. Only that Joseph Gargan rented the house, end quote. Well, Arena had had nothing to eat since breakfast. He just keeps answering phones and trying to give information for interviews. At one point, his sister calls and says, gee, I just saw you on the news. There had been no progress, and Arena is constantly dealing with the press. He's passing out copies now of Kennedy's accident report, but he doesn't really have much more to give to reporters. He would have if he had stopped and thought and asked some questions, but he hadn't done so. He said later, quote, I was still living in a dream world, thinking that I would hear from them, end quote. Remember initially that when the reporters were there, he orders them out of the station. And then Ted Kennedy is ushered out a back door away from the reporters, and finally he brings them in. He sustained hours before he finally releases the report, and now it's been hours since. And it says this had wrought a change in his perception of the case. Quote, reporters helped me realize a lot of things about the accident I hadn't had a chance to think about. Damore points out if reporters helped Arena to perceive the case in a different light, their demand for answers was forcing him to make precipitous judgments, now based on nothing more substantial than 2 brief visits to Dyke Bridge. So Damore is pointing out he has erred in both directions. He erred in doing nothing, and now he's erring in making a strong judgment about what case might be brought before he's even fully sat with the information. I want to point out this is the role of the press. We've talked about this in other episodes previously, I think involving Ask Not. But one of the gifts of a nation where we have freedom of speech is having a free and independent press. And if you look back at, even at this time, the way that journalism has been impacted and tried to be co-opted by our government through operations like Operation Mockingbird, if you want to look it up, and also things like what has happened in recent days where it's clear that the press has an agenda. They cover up certain stories that are to their political advantage of the candidates that they want, and they highlight stories, and that power is in their hands. And at this point, we still had these kind of boots on the ground journalists who had worked for the big names, purchased their own paper. They loved journalism. They loved digging. They wanted information. And they are actually, if Arena had seen it this way, they're an assistant to him. They're coming alongside him and providing an important service to him and to us. And, this role is a gift inside of a democratic republic like we have. But Arena doesn't see it like that yet. He is starting to see it, and yet even still, he's not. Now, he was beholden to Kennedy in a way through pressure. Now he's kind of beholden to the reporters through pressure, and he's still not exercising his own independent judgment of, here's what I really need to do. And I'm fully convinced of it in my own mind. He's not there. Remember that the lack of tire marks on Dyke Bridge had indicated to Arena that Senator Kennedy never attempted to brake the car, but drove straight over the side of the bridge. The investigation conducted at the scene, according to Arena, revealed that, quote, no criminal negligence was involved in the accident. There's nothing to indicate excessive speed or reckless driving, end quote. Going back to chapter 1, I just want to remind you that Mrs. Malm had told Arena she had heard a car pass the house, quote, going faster than usual, end quote, around midnight the previous evening, but nothing else. And Arena had been amazed that she had not heard the car hit the water. So Arena has the information in his possession that there had been an unusual rate of speed. He says there's nothing to indicate excessive speed or reckless driving, which is conceivably true. But I just want to point out Mrs. Malm's statement is not nothing. And he says there is nothing to indicate. I don't think that's entirely true here. Arena's sense of public relations did not fail him. He starts to pander. He says Senator Kennedy had been, quote, as cooperative as he could possibly be. Damore points out this declaration hardly matched the senator's refusal to answer a single question about the accident. Arena could not conceive of anything Kennedy gained by delaying the report of the accident. He said, quote, I don't know what went through his mind. He very well could have been in a state of shock, end quote. So he's judging that the accident is strictly accidental. And we're given a final look at Arena. It says, a weary Arena left the police station at midnight. He walked to the house on Cook Street. He takes his telephone and puts it off the hook. He had left the house that morning, the obscure police chief of a small tourist town. 15 hours later, he was making the front page of every newspaper in the country, involved in, quote, the most dismaying case, end quote, of his career. So, observations for chapter 10. Mills and Killen are each ultimately putting the judgment call on the other regarding the autopsy. Frank Keating, who called Killen, he sees clear negligence. It didn't impact the decisions that Killen made. Ted Kennedy's man, Dun Gifford, had gotten the Boiler Room girls off of Martha's Vineyard. He was trying to shepherd the body off as soon as possible. The Kopechnes are clearly baffled, and they are angry at Ted Kennedy's evasiveness and lack of details from the beginning. They are starting to realize there was a lot they didn't know. The question posed by journalists is significant. Why had Ted Kennedy driven himself when he had a chauffeur right there on Chappaquiddick? Arena, we see, is caught off guard by facts that he could have known. He could have prevented his own shock. He didn't do the work. Reporters have an important job to do, and Arena is too late starting to realize this. What observations do you guys have? What comments do you have for me, or feedback? If you have feedback about the format, if you have feedback or input about any aspect of these videos, I want to know it. I've adapted my end of chapter observations to a list that you can look at. Hopefully that's helpful, but you guys just let me know. I want to do what's helpful for all of us because I'm the one sitting here seeing my written observations, but I hope that's helpful for you guys. Please like, subscribe, and share these videos. I know that sounds so rote, but it really does make a difference when you're enthusiastic about something and you share it with someone else who you think might also be enthusiastic. I've had a number of you say that you are recovering from an injury and you are enjoying listening to the stories, or women who write in and say that maybe they've started having eye problems and they used to read all the time and now they can't, but by going through a book like this, they still get the enjoyment of intaking a story and getting to hear it read. Many of you use these videos in those sorts of ways to give yourself an exciting story to read. And so if you think about the people in your lives that have those sorts of situations, maybe share this with them. Go back to video 1 and share that with them and see if they're interested, and then they can catch up and you guys could talk about it and it could create an additional opportunity for community and relationships. So I hope these videos serve you in some of those ways, and I can't wait to read your comments and thoughts about these various questions. Kennedy machine, grinding into gear, the importance of reporters, lots of good stuff. You guys have a great day. Bye.